Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, or CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled, What Makes a Good Cyber Operator? My name is Steve Warzala. I am the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A few administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. Questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function, and time permitting, your question will be answered at the end of today's session. The briefing slides for today's presentation will be posted on our website within a few days. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Mr. Robert Dora. Rob is a research engineer at Assured Information Security, AIS. His particular area of expertise includes keystroke dynamics, software sensor development, battle damage assessment, and human subject experimentation. Mr. Dora has led several data analysis efforts that involve the study of human operators, using digital data to identify novel methods for measuring cognitive states, including trust, suspicion, and changes in workload. Mr. Dora graduated from Clarkson University with a BS in software engineering. Rob earned a master's degree in social psychology, and he has also obtained his designation as a certified information systems security professional. I will now turn the presentation over to Mr. Dora. Good afternoon, Rob. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. So, to give a little bit of background here before we get started, for those who are not familiar with Assured Information Security, we're a defense contractor that does a variety of cybersecurity research and development, ranging from computer network to defense to computer network attack. As a result, we deal with a lot of different types of cyber operators, including forensic analysts, reverse engineers, vulnerability assessments, and OCO operators. So, as Steve mentioned, bit of an odd duck here in that I've got a background in both software engineering and social psychology. As a result, I get to do a lot of interesting projects that tries to bridge that gap. So if you have any questions as we're going through, as Steve said, send them into the chat. I'll try and get through them as we go along, and we'll have some time at the end. So what we're going to be talking about today are skills, abilities, and traits, or SATs for short, that are critical for cyber operators. We did some preliminary research prior to this webinar to look at how these SATs vary for non-technical and technical engineers. We further divided the technical category into inexperienced and experienced operators. So I'll be discussing some of the methods that can be used to measure these SATs, and how we finish with how we would apply this and where we would go with future research. So SATs are a very broad category here. Skills, abilities, and traits can cover pretty much anything. So what we're going to be talking about specifically are cognitive traits, include things like perceptual speed, so how fast can you respond to visual stimuli and things like that. Problem-solving abilities. A lot of these things were documented back starting in the 60s by French Ekstrom and Price, and Ekstrom continued this research along with John Carroll. So we'll be discussing some of the preliminary research as we go forward that we did, but a lot of this, the choices that we made for what SATs to look at is based on this previous research. In addition to these cognitive factors and abilities, we're also looking at things like domain-specific skills. So, for example, a reverse engineer would need some hardware and software skills. and familiarity with certain tools, whereas an OCO operator might be would likely have different tools that they need to be familiar with. We'll also be looking at some behavioral metrics, including things like empathy and motivation. These things like motivation are a lot more context specific and harder to measure, but we'll be discussing some ways that you could bridge this gap. In addition to the work by Ekstrom and his colleagues, there's also been work bringing these cognitive factors into DoD and military situations. One of the first was the pilot selection, for pilot selection. The basic attribute tests, or BAT system, invented by Coretta in the 80s, it took a variety of these traits that Ekstrom identified and the tests that they identified and used them in the selection of operators. Dr. Jabbour went further with this and tried to identify which of these would be useful for cyber operators. Now, luckily for everyone here, I'm not going to bore you and read through this entire list. What we have here is these are the traits that were identified by Ekstrom and his colleagues in a book, the Modern Factor Analysis book. You'll notice a break about halfway through. There are several journal articles and revisions that were published later adding new traits to these. So if you have any questions on these traits, I'll be going over some of them in detail, the ones that we specifically looked at, but the Modern Factor Analysis book is a great way to get both an understanding of what these are and how you measure them. So, much like SATs, cyber operators is a very broad term. This can encompass anything from someone who does forensic analysis or reverse engineering all the way up to somebody on the offensive side who works in CNA, OCO, and that nature. So one of the key things that we'll be looking at here is, are there some factors that are applicable to all types of cyber operators? If so, which ones? And which are specific to other operators? So are there different traits that are more important for a reverse engineer than for an OCO operator? Obviously, as we talked about, some of the skills are going to vary between these, but are there basic traits as well? So the preliminary research that we did was a small survey conducted at AIS that had several of these traits that we selected. We asked subjects for their technical skills. We measured some behavior things such as empathy and coding and other abilities. So the ones that we selected are based on the work of Jabbour and Coretta and some of what I've seen from our interactions with cyber operators. I'll be going into more detail about induction, integrative processes, and visual memory as we go through, and describing both how they're measured and what they are. So we divided users into three basic categories: non-technical, inexperienced technical, and experienced technical. So inexperienced would be somebody who just came on board, maybe they're 1 or 2 years out of college, just starting to learn the trade, whereas experienced would be someone who's been around for a while, either done a lot of cyber operations or interacted a lot with the cyber operators. I wanted to further break this down into things like reverse engineering and forensic analysis, but we just didn't have enough data to make those categories. What we found as a result of our survey was statistically significant differences with induction, integrative processes, and visual memory. In particular, induction was significantly different for inexperienced versus experienced operators. Integrative processes was different for virtually all the categories. Visual memory was also different for inexperienced and experienced. Given that we had a rather small number of samples in this, there were some differences that were not significant, but certainly warrant further investigation, including induction and integrative processes for the remaining categories. So there are several challenges with all research of this nature, including collecting data on a sufficient number of users. We ended up with 23 users broken up to a little more than half technical and the other half non-technical. Inexperienced and experienced was split pretty much down the middle. Now these tests are designed to individually measure these things, taking about 30 to 45 minutes. As a result, if you're trying to measure a large number of traits, you end up with a trade-off between the number of users that you can get and the amount of information, the amount of different traits that you can get. You can cut some of these tests back, and as a result, shorten the experiment. But as a result, they may be you get less data for those individual traits. So you've got a trade-off here. We shortened them down about half their original size to ensure that we could get more users and try out more traits. Some of the surveys also have specific time limits and are harder to measure over like a web survey. These things such as what you would do for perceptual speed require that you have somebody administering the survey and monitoring time, because what you're looking at is how quickly somebody can complete something. As a result, perceptual speed was one of the factors that we didn't measure in this, because it would have required some additional overhead in this. But it's definitely one that we want to look at in the future. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe some of the traits that we measured and how we measured them. So induction is basically an innate research ability. How well can you form and test hypotheses? This is important for somebody such as a reverse engineer, vulnerability assessment, forensics, where you're looking through a lot of data. You're trying to you come up with an idea about what this data may mean, and then you collect more evidence and information to test out that hypothesis. This would be less important for somebody doing, for example, offensive cyber operations, where you're using a tool to launch an exploit or something like that. So the letter sets test is what's typically used to measure this. The subjects are given a 5 sets of 4 letters. They're asked to identify a rule that connects all of them and identify the one that breaks the rule. So, for example, here's two questions from the letter sets test. These ones are significantly easier than what you see going forward. For example, the first one, 4 of the 5 sets of letters have 3 of the same letter. QPPQ does not, and so that one's the answer. Similarly, example 2, they all go in consecutive order other than PRST, which skips the Q. As you get further down in this test, you end up going against ones where it might be offset by a certain number of letters. So you could have B, and then it skips 3 places, and then the next one goes back 1, and so the rules become more complicated and harder to follow. So one of the things that we found in this research that we thought might be interesting would be, how do we update this to specifically gear towards a technical operator? Can we get more information if we look at this from a problem that they're more likely to see in the field? So, for example, we have the same instructions here. Find a rule that makes 4 of the 5 options alike and select the option that does not follow the rule. So I'll leave this up for a second so people can read through it and figure out which one they think is correct. So in this case, C would be the answer. A, B, D, and E are all valid IP addresses, but C is not. 256 is not a valid IP. Give another example here. Find a rule that makes these 4 of the 5 alike and select the one that doesn't. Now in this case, it's hard to distinguish if D or E is the correct answer. So D is not a valid IP address, but E fails to follow the same numerical convention as the others, where each octet is 17 more than the previous one. Now this is important because some previous studies back in the 1940s looked at chess experts. They said, okay, we give board states to experts and novices and ask them to remember where the pieces are. The chess experts perform significantly better than the novices, but only at remembering realistic board states. If the pieces were in places where they would be invalid or it's very unlikely that they would there, they performed either no better or insignificantly better than the novices. As a result, we may see similar biases in cyber operators where you miss something that's important because you're not looking for it. I'll discuss a little bit more when we get to the future research of why this is important and how we could help fix this. So next up is integrative processes. Integrative processes are basically your ability to multitask, following multiple rules, keeping them all in your memory, and going through a task. So this combines a variety of different traits, including your short-term memory, your perceptual speed, so how fast you can go through and pick things out, and flexibility of closure. This is a skill that's important for most, if not all, cyber operators, in that you have to keep in mind a number of rules and react to a number of different things as you're going through tons of data. This is measured typically with the calendar test, which subjects are given a set of rules and they have to search through some visual stimuli and identify which of the what the correct answer is. So here's an example of what you might see on the calendar test. When this is typically administered, all 12 months are displayed, and subjects are given a small set of rules such as Monday through Friday are weekdays, Saturday and Sunday are weekends, any day that's circled is a holiday. So you get questions like, what is the third Tuesday of the month? That's pretty easy to find here. It's the 15th. Then you get things like, what's the third working day after the holiday? That's the 16th. Much like with induction, these get more complicated as you go through. So it might be, what is the fifth holiday in a month with at least 31 days? And so you have to go through and keep all these rules in mind while you're searching, and you have a limited amount of time to finish this test. Now, if we were to bring this to a more, update this to be more technical, we would be looking at something where an operator or analyst is looking through log files. They're told if, for example, if malware is detected with severity of 5 or higher, contact the malware department. However, if 6 instances of malware are attributed to a single user in 1 week period, you also have to talk about policy violations. So there's a variety of rules that they need to follow while they're processing all this information. So there are several other relevant traits in addition to induction and integrative processes. These include visual memory and perceptual speed, among many others. So visual memory is a representation of your short-term memory. It's related to perceptual speed. Basically, to test this, subjects are given what's called the building memory test. They're shown a map with buildings labeled in it, and then they're given a certain amount of time, usually a couple minutes, to memorize this map. Not allowed to take notes, and then they're shown a blank map, and they're asked to indicate where each of the buildings go. So short-term memory is critical for most, if not all, cyber operators and probably most places in general. The more information you can keep in mind helps you with things like integrative processes where you have to follow multiple rules. You have to be able to store that information in order to and recall it in order to be able to do your job. Perceptual speed applies a similar concept. However, it's more of a measure of how fast you can do something. So this is typically measured using what's called the finding A's test. Subjects are given a variety or given columns with a bunch of different words or random letters in there, and they're supposed to select all of the ones that have the letter A in them. They're asked to do this in a very short amount of time, and the columns are typically around like 31 words. So it's a measure of how quickly can this person find stimuli. Um, this is more important when you have a time-relevant cyber operator position, such as it might be more like a sysadmin or somebody who's going through log files and needs to actively find something so that they can update defensive measures. There are several of the other traits that we looked at, such as empathy, coding skills, and logic. We didn't find any significant differences for them between the technical and non-technical positions. Coding in particular, we didn't have most of the non-technical people fill that out because they didn't know. So obviously there's going to be a significant difference, but we were primarily looking at if we could get enough forensic operators versus reverse engineers to see if there was a difference in the way they debugged things, the process that they might use for coding things up. Empathy showed no difference between experienced, inexperienced cyber operators or operators that or non-technical personnel. Um, Similarly, um, uh, the technical skills and tools, we saw the same differences that we would see with coding and debugging, where the non-technical personnel obviously didn't have the same level of coding skills and the same tools that the technical personnel did. But since we weren't able to break that up with forensic analysts and reverse engineers and so on, we weren't able to determine if there was a significant difference there. So to bring this forward into the future, we would address some of the challenges that we talked about before, and primarily among that would be collecting a larger, more representative data set. Now, with a lot of data collection, you can go to a university and you can collect a lot of data, but that's going to be harder with something like this, where you need people with um, specific jobs and specific traits. So you need somebody with experience in forensics. You need some people with experience doing, red team assessments or OCO. You need people with experience in reverse engineers in addition to your non-technical people. So collecting a database of sufficient size and diversity is going to be critical in moving any of this research forward. Also would want to try and update some of the surveys to be more technical, as we'd shown here. Um, so first of all, we don't want to just assume that when I showed some of the IP address examples that those are relevant. We would want to do a comparison of a traditional measure for induction and do administer the technical surveys and look at the differences there and see if this is more valuable for us in the cyber operations field. The benefit of this sort of pilot study and research that we've done here is it helps us focus on some of the traits that have shown significance. So we know that induction and integrative processes are going to be critical here. Visual memory showed some importance, and a lot of the previous research has shown perceptual speed to be critical. So these are some of the traits that we would focus on moving forward. We'd also want to expand to look at more situational and contextual data. So we've seen a lot of research in the last several years on things like vigilance, trust and suspicion, cognitive workload. So in terms of vigilance, you're talking about how alert an operator is, how long they can sustain that, and being able to detect when their vigilance changes. If we can determine if there's a link between vigilance and some of these traits, it can help you determine not only when you need to switch out operators, but how you might want to train them, and even operator selection. I've done some work with trust and suspicion over the last several years, specifically coming up with remote methods for measuring trust and suspicion, such as using keystrokes to identify when someone is becoming suspicious or when their cognitive workload increases, as cognitive workload is a key component of suspicion. Now, something like this would be useful for a variety of reasons. Being able to tell when an operator is suspicious can help you better manage resources. But in terms of operator selection and training here, we would want to look and see, is there a link between some of these traits or a way that we can measure how skeptical an operator might be, how likely they are to trust the information they see. Cognitive workload is directly related to short-term memory, so it's a key component of visual memory and perceptual speed. If you can measure cognitive workload during these tasks, you can also tell how well they're doing during these tasks, and if they've reached their threshold. Can they do better? Do we need to do any sort of further administration here? But moving forward with any of this research, we need to make a very clear distinction. What we are looking for is a good operator. We're not trying to say what is an experienced operator. So people coming in, we need to be able to compare them directly against inexperienced and experienced operators. If we're just looking at traits that correlate with experienced operators, such as the tools that you might use, the skills that you might grow over time, then you're going to be throwing out a lot of good candidates. And this brings me into my next couple slides, which is how would we apply the research that we've done here. Before I go any further into this, I want to emphasize that the state this is in right now would not be something we would not be in a position to apply this to anything just yet. We would need to do some of the future research that I discussed on the previous slides. But we have two main areas that we can apply this to, and that would be operator selection and operator training. So selection, we try to focus primarily on stats that are fairly static. This would be things that aren't situational, like vigilance or coding abilities and things like that. And in order to do this, we need to determine which of these values you require a strong predisposition towards and which can be trained. So during this research, we want to do a more temporal study where we take operators just coming in, we measure their abilities, and then we measure them again after 6 months or a year as they start to become more experienced. And in this way, we can tell which of these traits are more variable. We can also look at a direct comparison just between operators that have been there for a long time and inexperienced operators. And this gives us the ability, or this will allow us to distinguish between which of these traits are most important for selection and which of these are most important for training. We'd also be determining if technical versions of the tests are more valuable than traditional versions, and if we need to sort of customize these based on the position that we're looking for. So the end goal here would be to identify a battery of tests similar to the BAT system for pilot selection to help with the selection of a variety of cyber operators. We'd also need to identify how this system varies depending on what type of position the operator is looking for, and look at if there's if there are any ways that it would need to be customized on an individual basis. Finally, that brings us into training. So can and how do we improve some of the traits that can be variant? A lot of what we've talked about so far, induction, integrative processes, visual memory, etc., tend to be fairly invariant from the past research. Skills tend to be much more easily trained, but as we start to bring in more traits here and more abilities, things such as motivation, empathy, we have to determine how we can improve these. Alternatively, we can look at helping operators avoid common mistakes. So when I showed the example before with the IP address that had where there were two possible correct answers. One wasn't an IP address, um, and the other didn't follow the numerical convention. Given that there was no instructions that these were IP addresses, this results in the person taking the test assumes, because of what they've seen in the past, that this is what they're looking for. For those of you who may not believe how much information is overlooked or have not seen the selective attention test before, there's a wonderful YouTube video that you should go through and keep your eye on the basketball, counting the number of passes that goes through. It's quite enlightening and eye-opening when you watch it back through a second time. So the end goal for this training is to identify weaknesses in operators early, either those that are coming in or those that are already there, and create a training regimen to help improve those abilities that are critical for these operations. It would also help to reduce some common errors and remove some biases that exist in terms of what information they're looking for to help cut down on some of the common mistakes that we see. So it looks like I blazed through this a lot quicker than I had intended to. So I'm open to all sorts of questions now.
Thank you, Rob. Some interesting research you're working on there, and so yeah, if there's any attendees on the line that have any questions, let me know. But so I'm curious, Rob. You had earlier in the beginning of your presentation, you kind of had the laundry list of the different cognitive skills, factors, abilities. I think it was Ekstrom and his crew there that kind of did some of that initial research. So I'm curious, for your particular experiment, how did you decide which subset of those traits to select to try to gather some additional information?
So in order to do this, we did look at a lot of the research that was performed by Dr. Jabbour and used in the BAT system. But a lot of it was also based on what we could measure readily. This was a very short turnaround, so we ignored things that had like a time aspect, such as perceptual speed, and would require a lot more overhead to administer, so that we could focus on getting more subjects. So there's a lot of ones that we wanted to look at, but didn't have the ability to in the time frame. But I think most of it was based on what we saw in the pilot selection and felt translated into cyber operations. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yes. And it's maybe related. One of our attendees was asking how this research translates to the skill sets as well.
So from what they've shown in the past, specifically for the pilot selection, pilots tend to have a lot of information dumped on them. This is particularly true if you start looking now more at the UAV or remotely piloted aircrafts, or whatever term we're using these days, pilots. You have an interface with dozens of buttons and information coming at you, and you have to make split-second decisions. So how fast you can look over that and make a decision, find exactly what you're looking for, is absolutely critical. So we would go through these, and we would have the operators identify some of the skills that they have. We would talk to some of their colleagues, and we would administer these and see what is different. So if we have somebody who's not a cyber operator and somebody who is a good cyber operator, or an experienced or an inexperienced one, see how those differ. Basically, this would involve determining if there's a statistically significant difference. Eventually, as you get more data, you'd start looking at developing predictive models to see, okay, from their results, can we predict if they're a good cyber operator or an experienced cyber operator or inexperienced or not a cyber operator. So does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, that's great. Thanks. Let's see. There's a question regarding the number of test subjects in your study. I thought I heard you say 23, but you can, verify that if that's the correct number or not.
We ended up, we only had 23 subjects. Some did not take every single one of the tests that were involved, but it broke down to about half and half with non-technical and technical. And for the technical, it was pretty close to being split between the two for which ones were experienced versus inexperienced. Um, the reason a lot of what I talked about was induction um, and integrative processes was because those were two of the earliest tests in the survey, and as a result, more people tended to take those. So we can be more confident in our results there.
Okay, and are you hoping to continue this research and try and get some larger number of folks to participate?
Yes, I'd like to. At this point, I don't have a funding vehicle or particular customer, but this is something that we're interested in going forward and talking to people more about. We've worked with the Human Effectiveness branch of the Air Force in the past, and they tend to be interested in this type of work. Um, we also have connections with a lot of different universities, and including the Air Force Academy, which might be a better university to actually get people that have this skill set, um, and potentially talking to some larger corporations that have an IRB, where you can get some technical people that you might not see at some of the universities.
Okay, thank you. Um, so let's see. One of the folks is interested. So if somebody took the test and they did poorly, on a certain skill set, is there any plans for you to try to, provide information that would help them improve those skills to, to do better, to increase their performance?
Yeah, so that would be one of the things with the training regiment that we would look at. Um, Generally, for a lot of these, since the information doesn't vary, the more times you take the test, the better you're going to do. Um, but if you measure with different values, people's scores for things like um, perceptual speed, induction, integrative processes don't tend to change that much over time. Um, there are ways you can get better at it. There are certain memory tests and things you can do to improve your memory and improve your speed, but it's usually not particularly significant. Um, However, one of the things we'd definitely be looking for in future research would be to try and figure out which of these traits we can train and how we would train them. But unfortunately, at this point, we don't have a good answer of how you'd improve them.
Okay, so it's kind of some people are kind of born naturally, have a certain level of talents or capabilities, and other aspects are more can be learned. So it's kind of I guess you're kind of walking that line in those two dimensions there.
Exactly.
Uh, let's see. So let's see. Somebody else asked about your where you got your pool of test subjects. I think also these were just internal AIS employees that took the initial study.
Yep. So we just did AIS employees to start with, primarily because of their experience in things ranging from forensics to reverse engineering and OCO. We felt that it was more representative of what we were going to find in the operational community than if we had just opened it up publicly.
Okay. And at the end of the presentation there, you seem to be. I think you made a comment where there's a major difference between a good operator and an experienced operator, and I guess for me that seemed kind of counterintuitive. Normally one would assume an individual that has more experience is going to be better a better operator, but I guess from your initial study, your initial results were kind of indicating that that may not actually be the case.
So our results didn't necessarily indicate that. We're not at that stage, but um, I just want to make sure that we differentiate. So yes, as you're more experienced, you tend to be better, but we want to make sure that what we're measuring for people coming in, so if you're doing this for operator selection, that you're not just measuring if they're experienced. We want to make sure that you're measuring that they have the potential to be good or they have the skills that would make a good operator and not the skills that they can learn. And so that's primarily the difference there, is we just want to make sure that what we're measuring is what we want to be measuring. Because if we're looking at something like experience, we can just look at, their number of years and things like that, and that's where you have more of the traditional interview. Those things are easier to see. We want to make sure that we're not, our research and models wouldn't produce the exact same results. Something new, something helpful.
Okay, but you did have this slide where you had the I think talking about the chess experts, and they're looking for the patterns that they know, and it kind of seems like their knowledge, their experience may sometimes prevent them from seeing the new anomalies, which maybe in a cyber threat, a new cyber attack, could possibly be a downside.
Yes, definitely. So as we get more experienced and we start doing the same tasks more often, we start to get blinders on. In the site community, this is close to what you would call habituation. Classic experience here is, so when people built railroads going through the U.S., a lot of the uh, bison, buffalo, they run away. It's a loud noise. But over time, they get used to the noise. That noise is always there. And then they start walking on the tracks and getting hit. Um, the more you have a certain stimuli, the easier it is to ignore and just focus on that one thing that you're looking for. So being able to introduce training regimens that would help break some of those biases. Some are important. Sometimes, you build up heuristics in your brain about what you're looking for, but we want to make sure that certain things aren't missed.
Okay, thanks. Um, I guess one of the other things I was curious about, I'm not quite sure if this is can relate it to this or not, but I think in the integrative processes area you were talking about, folks having to deal with multiple rules and multiple tasking. So I was kind of curious if there might be some kind of relationship with, say, like in the ISR world, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. There's a number of analysts that work in that domain, and there's a variety of different sensors, data gets collected, and then those folks a lot of times look at the different data sets from the different domains, try to correlate them together, try to fuse them to come out with some new piece of information. So I was just kind of curious if there might be any type of connection between what Intel analysts and the cyber world. I don't like I said, I'm not sure if there's any possible link or not, but just something I was curious about.
Yeah, I would say definitely. And one of the things that I'm seeing more of these days are new visualization techniques that try and take a lot of the information and put them into a format that the analysts can understand, fuse a lot of the results. Um, During this, you have to make sure some of the same things that we talked about here, that you're not losing information when you combine it here. Because if you lose critical information because you're only looking for something specific, then analysts are going to miss, can have the potential to miss critical things. Luckily, with a lot of the uh, machine learning and specifically deep learning techniques that are out there these days, the computer is much less likely to miss these things than we are if there's something significant. Um, but uh, but yeah, I would say that's definitely related. There's going to be abilities that ISR analysts have that are going to overlap a lot with somebody like a sysadmin or a forensic analyst.
Okay, thanks.
I think I saw another question on here earlier asking about where the tests can be obtained. Um,
Oh, yes, yes, right.
so the modern factor analysis book put out by Ekstrom and his colleagues has all of the tests in it. Um, I'm not sure where you can buy it these days. I have an old um, PDF obtained for research purposes that has a lot of those listed in there. But some of them are just public at this point, and if you search some of the names that I put up there, like calendar test or finding A's, you're likely to find some of the results or some of the tests.
Okay, thanks for picking up on that one. I did see it earlier, and it kind of slipped through the cracks there. So thanks for catching that. So unless I think that's covered all the questions we've got from the audience so far. So unless nobody else on the line has any other questions, I want to thank you, Rob, for taking the time to provide us with the information on the research you're doing. I think it's interesting, and I think I think there's some more activity you can conduct and hopefully gather some more data for us and maybe enlighten us down the road again. So once again, thanks for your time.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions that they think of afterwards, my email address is on here. So when the slides are posted, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to clarify anything.
And you can also send the questions if you do have questions afterwards. You can send them to info@csiac.org, and we can always get in touch with Rob that way as well. And if there's a number of questions, we could share them on our website for everybody's information as well. So once again, Thank you, Rob, and thanks to the attendees, and hope everyone has a good day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Be safe.